Imagine being sealed inside a steel box the size of a garden shed. The temperature inside has climbed past 50 degrees Celsius. The engine, a 105 horsepower Daimler, is running 18 inches from your body, separated by nothing. The noise is so loud that the man standing next to you, close enough to touch, cannot hear you speak. The air is thick with carbon monoxide, petrol vapor, cordite smoke, and exhaust fumes that make each breath feel like inhaling through a burning cloth. Every time the vehicle crosses a shell crater, it pitches violently, and you are thrown against iron walls with no padding, and the enemy outside is firing machine guns at point-blank range, each impact producing a shower of white hot metal fragments that fill the compartment like a swarm of invisible hornets, cutting through skin and eyes and any exposed flesh they can find. Now imagine that this is not a nightmare, this is your job. This is where you have volunteered to be. This is the inside of a British Mark I tank in September 1916, and the men who climbed into these machines and drove them toward German lines were among the bravest, most forgotten soldiers of the entire First World War. Their story begins not with a great invention, but with a catastrophic failure. By the winter of 1914, the Western Front had turned into something no military theorist had predicted, and no soldier had been trained to fight. Two armies stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border had dug themselves into the earth and constructed defensive systems of extraordinary complexity. Barbed wire stretched for miles in front of trenches that were reinforced with timber, concrete, and sandbags. Machine guns were positioned to cover every approach. Artillery could range onto any point on the battlefield within minutes. The great offensives of 1915, 1916, and 1917 would all discover the same terrible truth. Infantry advancing across open ground toward prepared defensive positions died in enormous numbers and gained almost nothing. The problem was understood clearly by commanders on both sides. What was not clear was the solution. The enemy's defensive strength came from the combination of wire, machine guns, and artillery. To cross no man's land successfully required either destroying these defenses entirely before the infantry advanced, or finding some method of protection that could carry soldiers across the killing ground faster than the enemy could aim and fire. Artillery alone could not solve the problem. The preliminary bombardments of the Somme in July 1916 lasted for 7 days and fired over 1,500,000 shells into the German lines. When the bombardment stopped and the infantry advanced, the German machine gunners emerged from deep dugouts, set up their weapons, and killed approximately 57,000 British soldiers in a single day. The shells had cut the wire in some places, in others they had not. The shells had destroyed some German positions. Many were intact. The bombardment had been the largest in history, and it had not been enough. Something different was required, something that could cross the wire and the mud and the craters, that could resist machine gun fire, that could carry weapons capable of destroying the machine gun nests that infantry could not approach, something that combined the protection of armor with the mobility of an engine. The concept that would become the tank emerged from several directions simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton of the British Army had observed early fighting in France and concluded that a Caterpillar tracked vehicle, armoured against rifle and machine gun fire, could potentially break the trench deadlock. He wrote a memorandum in October 1914 proposing what he called a machine gun destroyer. The War Office rejected it. Swinton persisted, and his proposals eventually reached Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, who saw in them something worth pursuing. Churchill established the Landships Committee in February 1915, a somewhat irregular arrangement that gave the Admiralty responsibility for developing a land vehicle. The Navy's involvement explains the peculiar naval terminology that would attach itself to early tank development and to the vehicles themselves. The compartments inside tanks were called sponsons, borrowed from naval architecture. The first prototypes were evaluated at a place called Hatfield Park, and the trials took place under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Workers were told they were building water carriers for the Russian army, and the code word water carrier gave way to the word tank, a deliberate piece of misdirection that became the permanent name for the weapon. The first prototype, given the name Little Willie, was completed in September 1915. It was quickly replaced by a more capable design, Mother, also known as Big Willie, which demonstrated in January 1916 that a tracked armoured vehicle could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and operate on the broken terrain of the Western Front. The War Office ordered 100 of the production version, designated the Mark I. The Mark I was a machine of extraordinary strangeness. Unlike anything that had come before it, it bore little resemblance to the tanks of later wars. Its shape was rhomboidal, a roughly diamond-shaped profile when viewed from the side. This shape was chosen specifically to allow the tank to cross wide trenches. A conventional vehicle with tracks running only along the bottom would have nosed into a trench and become stuck. The rhomboidal design allowed the tracks to run all the way around the vehicle's perimeter, meaning the front of the tank could extend over the far side of a trench while the vehicle was still crossing it. The Mark I was approximately 8 meters long, 4 meters wide across its sponsons, and 2.4 meters tall. It weighed 28 tons. Its Daimler engine produced 105 horsepower, giving the vehicle a maximum speed of approximately 6 kilometers per hour on firm ground. On the broken, cratered mud of the Western Front, its actual speed was often considerably less. It required a crew of 8 men to operate. 8 men. In a space barely larger than a modern garden shed, with an engine running in the same compartment, no separation between the fighting space and the mechanical components, no ventilation system worthy of the name, no suspension whatsoever. The crew layout reflected the vehicle's complexity. The vehicle commander, who doubled as one of the 2 drivers, sat at the front. The second driver, responsible for the 2-speed gearbox, sat beside him. 2 gearsmen operated the secondary gear levers for each track, a position that required constant coordination with both drivers, since there was no way to communicate over the engine noise except by hand signal and touch. Steering the Mark I required all 4 of these men working together, a process so cumbersome that sharp turns were essentially impossible, and even gentle direction changes required coordinated effort that took training and practice to execute smoothly. 2 or 4 additional crew members operated the weapons mounted in the sponsons on either side of the hull. The distinction between male and female tanks referred purely to armament. Male Mark Is carried 2 6-pounder quick-firing guns in the sponsons, intended for destroying fortified positions and vehicles. Female Mark Is carried 4 machine guns intended for engaging infantry. The distinction created immediate tactical complications because neither type could adequately perform the other's role, which meant tanks had to be deployed in mixed groups to cover all threat types. The weapons themselves added to the conditions inside the vehicle. Each time the 6-pounder fired, it filled the compartment with cordite smoke. The machine guns added their own fumes. In a vehicle with no ventilation, every weapon discharge made the air slightly worse. Over the course of an action lasting 30 minutes to an hour, the accumulation of smoke, fumes, and exhaust gases could render the interior barely breathable. Men described operating in conditions where they could not see across the interior of the vehicle through the smoke. The armor was 8 millimeters thick, which was sufficient to stop rifle and machine gun fire at standard ranges. This was its primary intended capability. The designers had concentrated on protecting crews from the most common and immediately lethal threat they would face crossing no man's land. What they had not fully anticipated was the effect of this armor under sustained fire. When a rifle bullet or machine gun round struck the external armor plate and failed to penetrate, it still transferred kinetic energy to the steel. This energy caused tiny fragments of metal to spool off the interior surface of the armor, launching at high velocity into the compartment. These fragments, called splash, were not large enough to be lethal in most cases, but they could blind, cut, and lacerate any exposed skin they reached. The crew's faces and eyes were the most vulnerable points. The fragments could enter through observation slits and visor openings. They could bounce off internal surfaces and change direction unpredictably. The solution issued to tank crews was a leather and chainmail mask that covered the face from forehead to chin, with narrow slits for vision. The mask was effective when worn. The problem was that wearing it in 50-degree heat while breathing fume-laden air while trying to operate complex mechanical controls in near darkness was deeply unpleasant. Many crew members removed their masks during actions, accepting the risk of facial injury for the marginal improvement in visibility and comfort. The after-action reports from the first tank engagements noted numerous facial injuries among crew members who had not been wearing their protective equipment. There was no suspension. The Mark I's hull rested directly on its track assemblies, with no spring or damping mechanism between them. Every impact with the ground, every crossing of a shell crater, every descent into a trench and climb out the other side, transmitted directly to the crew. Men inside described being thrown around the compartment, striking their heads and bodies against the iron walls and fittings, sustaining bruises and cuts and concussions from the vehicle's movement independent of any enemy action. In particularly rough terrain, crew members needed to brace themselves against any available handhold simply to maintain their positions. The heat requires particular emphasis because the accounts of men who served in early tanks return to it again and again as the defining physical characteristic of the experience. The Daimler engine ran continuously throughout any action, generating enormous quantities of heat in an enclosed space. External temperatures in northern France in the summer months could reach the mid-30s Celsius. Inside the tank, temperatures regularly reached 50 degrees Celsius, approximately 122 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the temperature of an oven set to its lowest heat setting. It is far beyond the range at which the human body can cool itself through perspiration alone. Men working in these temperatures were in continuous physiological distress. Sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes of entering the vehicle. Dehydration began rapidly. Cognitive function declined as core body temperature rose. The accounts describe men making simple mechanical errors, forgetting procedures, moving sluggishly, thinking slowly. These were the effects of heat stress on the human body, and they were happening to the men responsible for operating complex machinery in combat conditions while being fired upon. Carbon monoxide poisoning compounded everything. The exhaust system of the Daimler engine was imperfect, and in the early marks, carbon monoxide regularly leaked into the fighting compartment. Carbon monoxide is colourless, odourless, and completely undetectable without instruments. It displaces oxygen in the bloodstream, creating a form of hypoxia that produces confusion, disorientation, weakness, and eventually unconsciousness. Crew members in early tanks were experiencing low-level carbon monoxide poisoning during every action without knowing it. The symptoms, headache, confusion, reduced coordination, were attributed to the heat, the noise, the stress of combat. Not until post-war medical examination of tank crew casualty records did the full extent of carbon monoxide exposure become clear. The accounts from surviving crew members describe men collapsing as they exited tanks after action, not from enemy wounds but from the accumulated effects of heat, fumes, and carbon monoxide. Men who had appeared functional inside the vehicle, performing their duties, would emerge into fresh air and immediately lose consciousness as the contrast between the toxic atmosphere they had been breathing and normal air overwhelmed their systems. The medical reports from tank actions noted this phenomenon repeatedly. Entire crews, apparently uninjured, were incapacitated by toxic exposure that had accumulated over the course of an engagement. The noise was a form of assault in itself. The Daimler engine at full power produced sound levels that exceeded anything most men had previously encountered except artillery bombardment. Unlike artillery, the engine noise was continuous, not intermittent. It did not stop. It surrounded the crew from the moment the engine started to the moment it stopped. Crew members needed to communicate constantly to coordinate the vehicle's operation, but voice communication was impossible over the engine noise. They developed a system of hand signals, touches, and gestures that allowed basic coordination but limited communication to the simplest instructions. Complex tactical decisions had to be made by the commander alone, without being able to consult or brief his crew. The observation capability of the Mark I was almost comically inadequate for a combat vehicle. The crew's view of the outside world was provided by narrow observation slits cut into the armour and covered with protective glass of limited quality. These slits were sized to minimise the opening that enemy fire could exploit, which meant they provided a tiny field of view. The driver's forward vision was particularly limited, as the rhomboidal hull shape meant the front of the vehicle obscured the ground immediately ahead. Tanks regularly drove into shell craters, trenches, and obstacles that their drivers simply could not see until it was too late. The solution to this visibility problem, used repeatedly in early tank actions, was for the vehicle commander to get out and walk ahead of the tank on foot, directing it through terrain he could see and it could not. This meant the vehicle commander was walking in no man's land, in front of a metal vehicle, exposed to fire from every direction, while directing a machine moving at walking pace behind him. Several tank commanders were killed while performing this function in the first engagements. It was understood as a necessary risk, an absurd solution to an absurd design problem, accepted because there was no alternative. The training program for the first tank crews was conducted in conditions of extreme secrecy at Elvedon in Suffolk, where the flat farmland provided terrain roughly analogous to the Western Front. The men who volunteered for the heavy branch of the machine gun corps, as the tank units were initially designated, were told almost nothing about what they would be operating. They were informed they were working on water carriers, and this cover story held well enough that German intelligence did not penetrate it before the first deployment. King George V inspected the tanks at Elverdon on July 26, 1916, a visit conducted with sufficient security precautions that even this royal inspection left no public record. The men practiced driving, practiced operating the weapons, practiced the coordinated gearmanship required to steer the vehicle. They did not practice in conditions remotely resembling what they would encounter in France, because no training area could replicate the ground conditions of the Somme battlefield after months of bombardment and rainfall. On August 31st, 1916, the first tanks left England for France. They crossed the Channel on transport ships and were moved by rail to the Somme area, their distinctive shapes hidden under tarpaulins and their movement conducted at night wherever possible. The crews knew they were going into action soon. They did not know exactly when or exactly where. The operational details were held at a level above most crew members, partly for security and partly because the tactical plan was still being finalized by commanders who were uncertain how to employ a weapon no one had ever used in combat before. September 15th, 1916, 4:45 in the morning, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. 49 Mark I tanks had been allocated for this attack. Of these, only 31 reached their start lines. 18 had broken down during the movement to their starting positions. The Daimler engine's reliability was limited under normal conditions, and the terrain between the assembly areas and the front line was anything but normal. Broken ground, shell craters, mud, debris, and the general devastation of months of battle had torn apart every surface the tanks had to cross. Tracks slipped, engines overheated, mechanical components failed in the dark, with no light permitted because German observation posts would have reported any illumination. Crews worked in darkness trying to diagnose and repair mechanical failures they could barely see, knowing that time was running out before the attack began. The 31 tanks that made it to the start line were distributed along the British Fourth Army's front. Their crews had been in their vehicles since before midnight, 7 or more hours in the iron heat, breathing the fumes, trying to sleep in positions that made sleep almost impossible. By the time the attack began, most crews had already been subjected to conditions that would have been considered medically dangerous in any civilian context. When the barrage lifted and the tanks began moving forward at walking pace, German soldiers in the front line encountered something they had never seen and for which nothing in their training had prepared them. The accounts from German soldiers who survived the opening of the attack describe reactions ranging from immediate flight to complete paralysis. One garrison, confronted by a tank advancing directly toward their trench, simply abandoned their position and ran. Others fired their rifles at the approaching machines and watched the bullets bounce off with effects that seemed impossible. A few brave or desperate German soldiers attempted to attack the tanks directly, throwing grenades, trying to jam the tracks. Most of these men died. The reality inside the attacking tanks was considerably less dramatic than the terror outside. The heat was already overwhelming after hours in the vehicle. The noise made communication impossible. The observation slits showed fragments of cratered ground, smoke, and occasional flashes of fire. Tank commanders attempting to navigate toward their objectives were working from maps and compass bearings, trying to relate the chaos outside to the clean lines of a briefing map, in conditions of heat and noise and limited visibility that made coherent thought progressively more difficult. Tank C1, commanded by Captain Harold Mortimer, attacked along the main road toward Flers. The tank moved down the road with infantry following, engaging German positions and clearing the way for the advancing British troops. Mortimer's tank reached the outskirts of Flers and continued into the village itself, the first time a tank had entered a defended settlement in combat. A British aircraft, observing from above, reported to headquarters that a tank was proceeding down the main street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind it. This report became one of the most famous of the war, the image of mechanical triumph advancing through a captured village, and it was at least partially accurate. The tank had reached Flers. The British Army was not cheering behind it in the triumphant way the report implied. They were advancing cautiously through terrain still under fire, but they were advancing. By the end of the first day, the tanks had achieved significant results in certain sectors and had broken down or been knocked out in others. The village of Flers had been captured. Ground had been gained that would have cost thousands of infantry lives to take by conventional assault. Several German positions had been overrun by tanks whose armour made them impervious to rifle and machine gun fire. But the machines had demonstrated their fragility as clearly as their capability. many of the 31 that had reached their start lines never reached their objectives. Mechanical failure, ditching in craters, and enemy artillery fire had eliminated a significant portion of the attacking force before the day was over. The men who came out of the tanks at the end of September 15, 1916 were in poor condition. Medical reports noted multiple cases of heat exhaustion, several cases of apparent carbon monoxide poisoning, numerous facial and hand injuries from metal splash, and multiple cases of bruising and minor concussion from the vehicle's violent movement over broken ground. Most crew members also reported severe headaches, nausea, and temporary hearing impairment from the engine noise. These were the standard after effects of a tank engagement in 1916, not the exceptional consequences of an unusually difficult action. The next day, September 16th, only 3 tanks remained operational. The rest had broken down, been disabled by enemy fire, or required extensive mechanical repair before they could move again. The limitation of the Mark I as a sustained-use weapon system was already apparent. The battles of the Somme continued into November 1916, and tanks were used in several subsequent actions. The results were consistently mixed in the same way as the first engagement. Where tanks could operate on firm enough ground to move reliably, they terrified the enemy and achieved objectives that conventional infantry could not. Where they broke down or became ditched, they became liabilities, obstacles, and sometimes traps for the men inside them. What happened when a tank was hit and caught fire was one of the nightmare scenarios of early tank warfare. The Mark I's fuel system was gravity-fed, meaning the petrol tank was positioned high in the front of the vehicle to allow fuel to flow down to the engine. This design placed the fuel supply in one of the most vulnerable positions possible. A direct hit by artillery on the front of the tank frequently ruptured the fuel tank and sprayed petrol across the hot engine, igniting it instantly. A tank struck by artillery fire and set alight went from operational vehicle to crematorium in seconds. The crew's options for escape from a burning tank were limited. There were hatches, but they were small, positioned awkwardly, and required time to open that the fire did not always provide. A crew of 8 men attempting to exit through narrow hatches while the vehicle burned around them, possibly while wounded, certainly in a state of heat exhaustion and disorientation, had a limited prospect of survival. The accounts of tank crews who escaped burning vehicles describe experiences of absolute terror, of men burned while climbing through hatches, of men who could not be extracted in time, of the sounds inside a burning tank that the survivors refused to describe in detail to anyone who had not been there. The psychological consequences for tank crews extended beyond individual actions. Men who had been through a serious tank action, who had experienced the heat and fumes and the terror of being hit, frequently showed symptoms that would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The term shell shock was applied broadly to all forms of combat-related psychological trauma during the First World War, without distinguishing between the specific causes or presentations. Tank crew shell shock had particular characteristics that reflected the particular nature of their experience. The enclosed space, the heat, the inability to escape during an action, the complete dependence on the mechanical reliability of a machine that regularly failed at the worst possible moment, and the unique combination of absolute helplessness, since the crew could not run or take cover, and intense physical action created a psychological profile that psychiatrists observing tank crew casualties noted as distinctive. Men who had served multiple tours in tanks showed chronic symptoms, persistent headaches often attributed to carbon monoxide exposure, hearing loss from engine noise, sleep disturbances, severe anxiety in enclosed spaces, an inability to tolerate heat that persisted for years after the war. The development of tank design improved conditions incrementally, but the fundamental problems were resistant to quick solutions. The Mark II and Mark III were essentially the same design as the Mark I, with minor modifications, used primarily for training rather than combat. The Mark IV, introduced in time for the Battle of Messines in June 1917, addressed several of the most serious mechanical issues and moved the fuel tank to a safer position outside the fighting compartment. The armour was thickened in certain areas, the sponsons were redesigned to fold inward for rail transport, but the Mark IV retained the same basic layout as the Mark I, the same engine location, the same steering system requiring 4 men to coordinate, the same fundamental lack of ventilation, the same brutal interior conditions. The improvement most immediately meaningful to crews was the relocation of the fuel tank. Previous to the Mark IV, tank crews had operated knowing that a penetrating hit on their vehicle's most vulnerable forward section would shower them with burning petrol. The new design reduced this specific risk substantially. Crews still faced heat, fumes, carbon monoxide, metal splash, and the mechanical unreliability that had plagued tanks from the beginning, but at least they were slightly less likely to be burned alive inside their vehicle. The Mark IV was the tank used at the Battle of Passchendaele in August 1917, when a crew commanding a vehicle named Fray Bentos entered one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of the war. The Battle of Passchendaele, the Third Battle of Ypres, was fought in conditions that have become synonymous with the worst of the First World War. The Flemish plain around Ypres drained poorly under normal conditions. The summer of 1917 brought exceptional rainfall. The preliminary British bombardment destroyed the drainage ditches that farmers had maintained for centuries, turning the battlefield into a bog of liquid mud that swallowed men whole and mired vehicles instantly. The conditions were so bad that General Douglas Haig's personal diary records doubt about continuing the offensive, and the official historians of the campaign would later characterize the mud of Passchendaele as a defining image of the war's suffering. Into this landscape, at 4 in the morning on August 22nd, 1917, the crew of Fray Bentos set out on what they expected to be a conventional tank assault in support of an infantry attack by the British 61st Division near the village of St. Julien. Captain Donald Richardson was a grocer before the war, which is how his tank came to be named after a brand of tinned meat he had stocked on his shelves. His crew were Sergeant Robert Misson, who would become the most detailed recorder of what followed, Second Lieutenant George Hill, Lance Corporal Ernest Brady, and gunners William Morrie, Ernest Hayton, Frederick Arthurs, Percy Budd, and James Binley. 9 men in a Mark IV, advancing through Passchendaele mud. Richardson walked beside the tank during the initial advance, the vehicle commander performing the standard function of guiding his vehicle through terrain too broken for the driver to navigate from inside. The tank came under German machine gun fire from a fortified farm called Somme Farm, and Richardson climbed back inside. The tank continued forward, crossing ground that grew progressively softer as they moved into territory that the bombardment had reduced to a quagmire. Then the ground gave way. Fray Bentos entered soft mud around a ditch and slid sideways into the depression before the driver could correct. Second Lieutenant Hill, sitting at his position, was struck by shrapnel at the moment of the ditching and fell back from his seat. Richardson, taking control to try to drive the tank free, found the vehicle unresponsive, sinking deeper into the mud with every engine revolution. Fray Bentos was stuck. The tracks could find no purchase in the liquid mud. The 28-ton vehicle was settling steadily into a crater that had no firm bottom. Sergeant Misson and Lance Corporal Brady volunteered to go outside and attempt to attach the unditching gear, lengths of steel-clad timber designed to be fastened under the tracks to give them grip on soft ground. It was dangerous work at the best of times, requiring men to work around the moving tracks of a vehicle while under potential fire. In the conditions of Passchendaele, with German forces watching from positions 30 yards away, it was something considerably worse than dangerous. Misson wrote in his account, "I got out of right sponson door, but I heard bullets hitting the tank and saw some Boche about 30 yards off firing at me. I got in again." Brady had exited from the other side simultaneously. He did not get back in. He was shot while attempting to attach the unditching gear and fell beneath the sinking tank. Sergeant Misson later recorded that Gunner Arthurs reported Brady dead. His body was never found. Lance Corporal Ernest Brady was absorbed into the mud of Passchendaele, along with the tens of thousands of other men who disappeared into that ground without trace. 8 men remained in the tank. The infantry attack that Fray Bentos had been supporting stalled and then reversed, British infantry pulling back to their lines under German fire. The withdrawal left the tank isolated in no man's land, stuck in a crater, surrounded on 3 sides by German forces who were immediately aware of where it was and who understood the value of the secret weapon the British had lost. For the next 60 hours, the crew of Fray Bentos fought for survival. The tank's guns were still partially operational despite its tilted position. The 6-pounders could be brought to bear on some angles. The machine guns covered additional sectors. When German soldiers attempted to approach the tank across the open ground, the crew engaged them. The accounts describe repeated German attempts to reach the vehicle, each repelled by fire from the crew. In the spaces between attacks, the men attended to their wounded, treated Hill's head and neck wounds with what medical supplies they had, dressed Morrie's arm and leg injuries. Bud had been unconscious for approximately 2 hours following the ditching and had only recently recovered. The temperature inside the tank was extreme even without the engine running. The August sun heated the steel hull directly. The small interior, crowded with 9 men and their equipment, had no cooling mechanism. The men were already exhausted from the drive and the action. They were now wounded, trapped, short of water, and being shot at from multiple directions, with no prospect of immediate rescue. At some point during the first night, German soldiers crept close enough to the tank to climb onto the hull. One dropped a grenade through a hatch. Inside, someone, the accounts do not identify who, seized the grenade before it detonated and threw it back out. The grenade exploded outside the tank, injuring several of the German soldiers who had not yet taken cover. On the second day, British snipers and observers watching the area from the British lines concluded that Fray Bentos had been captured by the Germans and that the figures they could see moving around it were enemy soldiers. British artillery was directed onto the tank's position. The crew, already under German fire, now came under British fire as well. The shells detonated close enough to the tank that fragments struck the hull. The crew had no way to signal their own forces, no radio, no flags visible in the confusion, no means of communication with the lines 300 meters away. Misson made the decision to go himself. He exited the tank, crawled through the mud and shell craters of no man's land, evaded German fire that followed him across the open ground, and reached the British lines. He identified himself to soldiers of the Black Watch Regiment who had been watching the area and explained that the tank still had a live crew. The shelling stopped. The crew of Fray Bentos had not been abandoned, though it had felt that way. The British simply had not known they were there. Richardson, assessing the situation on the second night, concluded that remaining in the tank was no longer survivable. Water had run out the previous day. The crew had drained the radiator and drunk the contaminated water from it, the only available liquid. Food was gone. The wounded were deteriorating. The ammunition was nearly exhausted. The Germans were still out there, still probing, still waiting for the moment when the tank's defensive fire ceased. Before they left, the crew methodically dismantled Fray Bentos. They removed the firing mechanisms from the 6-pounder guns and the machine guns, rendering them inoperable. They gathered the maps, the cipher materials, everything that could provide intelligence value to the Germans if captured. Then, one by one, beginning at 9 in the evening on August 24th, they crawled back to the British lines through the mud. They crawled individually, separated by intervals of time to reduce the chance of multiple losses if a man was spotted. Each man crossed approximately 300 meters of shell-cratered ground under potential fire. Some of them were wounded. All of them were dehydrated, starved, and in a condition of physical and psychological exhaustion that no medical assessment at the time had language adequate to describe. Every one of the 8 surviving crew members made it back to the British lines. Captain Richardson received the Military Cross. Second Lieutenant Hill received the Military Cross. Sergeant Misson and Gunner Maury received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Gunners Hayton, Arthurs, Budd, and Binley received the Military Medal. The crew of Fray Bentos were the most decorated tank crew of the First World War. Only Gunner James Binley emerged physically uninjured. The medical records note that he was left shocked. In the medical terminology of 1917, shock indicated a condition ranging from concussion to complete psychological breakdown. What Binley had witnessed and endured in those 60 hours would remain with him in ways that the single word shocked could never adequately capture. The Battle of Cambrai in November 1917 was planned as the definitive demonstration of what tanks could achieve when used properly. The battles of the Somme and Passchendaele had shown tanks operating in conditions that were almost impossibly difficult, on ground torn apart by months of bombardment and waterlogged by rain. Cambrai offered different terrain. The rolling chalk plains south of the town had not been heavily bombarded and provided relatively firm ground. The Hindenburg Line defences, while formidable, were sited on terrain that tanks could actually traverse. Brigadier General Hugh Ehlers, commanding the newly formed Tank Corps, proposed using the Cambrai terrain for a mass tank assault that would demonstrate the weapon's capabilities on ground suitable for its use. His Chief of Staff, Colonel John Fuller, developed the operational plan. 476 tanks were assembled in secret, moved forward at night, their engines masked by aircraft noise from Royal Flying Corps aircraft that flew low over the German lines during each night's movement to conceal the sound of the tank columns. 378 combat tanks advanced at 6:20 in the morning on November 20th, 1917, alongside 6 infantry divisions. There was no preliminary artillery bombardment, the absence of which had been one of the planning innovations at Cambrai. Previous tank attacks had followed bombardments that churned up the ground, created the craters and mud that immobilized vehicles, and warned the enemy that an attack was imminent. At Cambrai, the guns opened fire simultaneously with the tank advance, achieving tactical surprise that the Germans had not expected. The results on the first day were extraordinary by the standards of Western Front warfare. The German front line was overrun in minutes by the combination of tanks and infantry. By the afternoon, British forces had penetrated to depths of over 8 kilometers in some sectors, an advance measured in hours that had previously taken months and hundreds of thousands of casualties. Church bells were rung in London, the first time during the war that bells had been rung to celebrate a victory. The newspapers reported a triumph. Inside the tanks advancing on that first morning, the conditions were the same as they had always been. The Mark IV represented improvements over the Mark I, but the fundamental experience of being a tank crew member had not changed substantially. The heat was still crushing, the fumes were still toxic, the noise was still deafening. The coordination required to steer the vehicle still demanded constant non-verbal communication between 4 men who could not hear each other speak. The observation slits still showed a limited, distorted view of a battlefield that the crew was crossing at walking pace while entirely dependent on the mechanical reliability of their vehicle. On that first day, the Tank Corps lost 179 tanks. 65 were knocked out by enemy action, 71 suffered mechanical breakdowns, 43 were lost to other causes including ditching, getting stuck, and navigational errors. By the second day of the battle, only approximately half the combat tanks remained operational. By the third day, the attack's momentum was clearly exhausted. The German army counterattacked on November 30th with stormtrooper tactics developed specifically to defeat the tank and infantry combination that had been so effective on the first day, and recovered most of the ground that had been captured. The pattern at Cambrai exposed the central limitation that would constrain tank operations for the remainder of the war. Tanks could achieve surprise and break through defensive lines with extraordinary efficiency when used en masse on suitable terrain, but they could not be sustained. Mechanical attrition was constant, replacement was slow, the supply of trained crews, men who could function in the conditions inside a tank through an extended operation, was limited by the physical demands those conditions imposed on human bodies. Tank units needed to be withdrawn and rebuilt after every major action, while infantry units could be reinforced and returned to combat more rapidly. The men who formed those tank units were exceptional in a way that the military establishment of 1916 and 1917 did not fully appreciate at the time. They had volunteered for a weapon system that did not yet exist and whose capabilities no one could accurately predict. They operated in conditions of physical stress that exceeded almost anything else on the Western Front. The frontline infantry lived in wet, cold, rat-infested trenches and faced artillery, gas, and machine gun fire. Their suffering was real and well documented, but they could take cover. They could run. When an artillery barrage began, an infantryman could press himself into the earth and wait for it to pass. A tank crew could do none of these things. They were sealed inside their machine, and they stayed there, because leaving the vehicle in combat meant certain death from the fire directed at it. The psychological demand of this constraint, of being unable to take cover, unable to escape, unable to reduce personal risk by individual action, was distinctive. Military psychologists examining shell shock cases among tank crew members after the war noted that the helplessness of the tank crew situation, the complete dependence on a machine that might or might not survive the action, produced patterns of anxiety and trauma that differed from the patterns seen in infantry. Infantry shell shock was frequently associated with the experience of sustained artillery bombardment, of waiting in a trench while shells landed around you. Tank crew shell shock was frequently associated with the experience of being trapped, of enclosed space, of fire, of the smell of burning metal and fuel that triggered visceral memories of the worst moments of their service. The Mark V, introduced in mid-1918, represented the most significant improvement in tank technology during the war. The new Wilson epicyclic gearbox allowed a single driver to steer the vehicle without requiring the secondary gearsman. This reduced the crew from 8 to 7 and eliminated the most demanding coordination challenge of previous tank operation. The engine was a Ricardo unit of 150 horsepower, significantly more powerful than the Daimler it replaced. The armour was marginally improved, the observation capability was slightly better, but even the Mark V retained the fundamental design philosophy of the earlier tanks, and the conditions inside it remained, by any objective measure, extremely hazardous. Carbon monoxide exposure was still a problem, heat was still excessive, the noise was still damaging to hearing. The tanks that fought at the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918, the opening of what became known as the 100 Days Offensive that ended the war, carried crews who accepted these conditions as simply the terms of their service. The Battle of Amiens on August 8th is sometimes called Germany's Black Day. More than 500 tanks participated. The advance achieved on the first day exceeded even Cambrai, catching the German army in a moment of tactical and moral exhaustion from which it did not recover. The war would end 3 months later. Of the 500 tanks that attacked on August 8th, how many completed the day's action with their full crews in functional condition is not recorded with precision. The casualty records of the tank corps across the 100 days show the same pattern that had characterized tank operations from the first day: significant mechanical attrition, consistent losses to enemy action, and steady psychological attrition among crews who were being used in engagement after engagement with insufficient recovery time between them. The armistice of November 11, 1918 found the tank corps depleted, exhausted, and in the process of planning operations that were to have been conducted in 1919 with larger, improved vehicles. The war ended before those vehicles were needed. The last tank crews of the First World War came out of their machines and tried to return to a normal world. Many found it difficult. The combination of carbon monoxide exposure, heat stress, noise damage, physical trauma from the vehicle's movement, and the psychological consequences of months of enclosed space combat under conditions of complete helplessness had effects that persisted long after the noise and heat were gone. The hearing loss was permanent for many veterans. The headaches that had accompanied every tank action were not always temporary. Men who had spent months in the toxic atmosphere of early tanks carried the effects of that exposure in their lungs and their blood for years. The tank crews of the First World War left almost no individual monuments. The war's memory settled on the infantry and their trenches, on the cavalry and their futile charges, on the generals and their controversies. The men who drove iron boxes weighing 28 tons across the mud of the Somme and Passchendaele, who breathed the fumes and endured the heat and held their positions in burning vehicles because there was nowhere else to go, received their medals and returned to their civilian lives, and were largely forgotten. Their machines survived better than their stories. The tank Clan Leslie, the world's oldest surviving combat tank, is on display at the Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset. It was discovered in 1970 in the grounds of Hatfield House, where the first tank trials had taken place in 1915. It is a machine of extraordinary strangeness even to modern eyes, the rhomboidal shape unlike anything in subsequent tank design, the sponsons jutting awkwardly from the sides, the whole vehicle exuding a quality of improvised urgency, of a solution assembled from available parts to address a problem that was killing men faster than any previous technology in history. The Bovington Museum also holds Sergeant Robert Misson's Bible and his uniform from the Fray Bentos action. These are the physical remnants of a man who climbed into a steel box in the mud of Passchendaele and spent 60 hours fighting for his survival with weapons and resolve that neither his training nor his engineering had been designed to provide. He crawled back to the British lines through the mud and reported his crew's position to soldiers who had believed him dead. He went back out into no man's land and led those soldiers to what remained of his crew. He received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He survived the war. He went home. The machines he served in were primitive, dangerous, and in many respects barely functional. The conditions they created for their crews were medically hazardous in ways that the designers had not anticipated, and the military commanders had not accounted for in their operational planning. The men who operated them were asked to endure conditions that should, by any rational calculation, have been beyond endurance. They endured them anyway. They drove into German lines at walking pace in iron boxes that were too hot, too loud, too toxic, and too prone to mechanical failure. They crossed ground that was designed to kill them, exposed to fire they could not avoid, sealed into spaces they could not escape. They did this because the war required it, and because they had volunteered for it, and because the man beside them in the iron heat had also volunteered and was also staying. The first tank crews of the First World War were, by any measure, extraordinary men. They are not remembered the way they deserve to be. The iron coffins they climbed into every morning are remembered better than their names. That is the nature of their war and of the century that followed it.